Richard the Lionheart. His name echoes through centuries as a symbol of courage, honor, and knightly virtue. But behind the golden armor and the Crusader's banner lies a far more complex man, one driven by ambition, politics, and personal pride. In this documentary, we'll uncover the real Richard, the warrior who spent barely any time in his own kingdom, the ruler who defied his father, and the captive king who became a symbol of medieval Europe. We'll journey from the castles of England to the battlefields of the Holy Land, revealing the triumphs, betrayals, and myths that shaped the Lionheart's legend. If you enjoy stories that bring history to life, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and join us, because we're about to begin the untold story of Richard the Lionheart. Richard the Lionheart was born into a world of power, intrigue, and ambition. His life began not in peace, but in the middle of one of Europe's most turbulent dynasties. He entered the world on September 8, 1157, in Oxford, England. Though England was only one piece of the vast realm that would define his destiny. His father, King Henry II, ruled over the Angevin Empire, a collection of territories stretching from the cold highlands of Scotland to the warm vineyards of southern France. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most extraordinary women of the Middle Ages, a queen, a former crusader, and a woman whose intelligence and influence rivaled that of any king. Together they created an empire that seemed unshakable, yet inside their marriage a storm was brewing, a storm that would shape Richard's very soul. Henry II was a ruler of iron will and relentless energy. He reformed English law, expanded his territories, and imposed his authority on a Europe constantly at war. But his strength was also his weakness. He trusted few, controlled all, and demanded obedience from his sons, who were princes in name but pawns in his empire. Eleanor, on the other hand, was his equal in both intellect and ambition. As Duchess of Aquitaine, she ruled over one of the richest and most cultured lands in Europe, a region that valued art, chivalry, and courtly love. When Henry tried to dominate her as he did his kingdom, Eleanor resisted, and their union turned from partnership to rivalry. In this environment of brilliance and conflict, Richard grew up learning two opposing lessons: the art of kingship from his father and the art of defiance from his mother. He was her favorite, the child she saw as the rightful heir to her own duchy. And she ensured that her son would inherit not just her lands, but also her fiery pride and sense of independence. From a young age, Richard showed the qualities that would define him for life: courage, intelligence, and an unyielding spirit. He was educated in music, poetry, and warfare, embodying the ideal of the knightly prince, both cultured and dangerous. The world around him, however, was far from ideal. The Angevin Empire was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of territories bound by force and fragile loyalty. Each region had its own laws, customs, and languages. The French king, Louis VII, who was, ironically, Eleanor's former husband, sought to undermine Henry's power at every opportunity. Beneath the splendor of the royal courts lay a constant tension, a chessboard of alliances and betrayals, where even family ties were weapons. As Richard reached adolescence, he watched his father's empire begin to crack under the weight of its own ambition. Henry's sons, Henry the young king, Geoffrey, Richard, and John, were raised to rule but denied real authority. Their father feared their rivalry, but also caused it, pitting them against each other to maintain control. The result was predictable: rebellion. By his mid-teens, Richard found himself not just a prince, but a potential rebel. He was given command of Aquitaine, his mother's domain, but his rule was far from secure. The powerful barons of the south resisted his authority, and neighboring lords constantly tested his resolve. Richard learned to lead not from a throne, but from horseback, sword in hand. He became known for his ferocity in battle, earning respect and fear in equal measure. Yet beneath his valor, there grew a deep resentment, not against his enemies, but against his father, who refused to grant him true independence. Eleanor, who shared her son's frustration, became the heart of a great family revolt. In 1173, Richard joined his brothers in open rebellion against Henry II. It was a dramatic act of defiance, one that revealed how fractured the royal family had become. The young princes, encouraged by their mother and supported by the French king, hoped to divide their father's empire among themselves. But Henry was a master strategist, and the rebellion failed. Eleanor was captured and imprisoned, spending years in confinement. Richard, humiliated but forgiven, was forced to kneel before the man he hated and swear loyalty once again. That humiliation marked him deeply. From that moment, Richard's life became a struggle between duty and desire, loyalty to his father's crown, and the longing to rule on his own terms. The rebellion had failed, but the fire in him had not died. If anything, it had hardened. He became colder, more disciplined, more dangerous. He would never again fight for another man's vision. The young prince who had once dreamed of chivalry had learned the darker truths of power. That family could be an enemy, that mercy was weakness, and that freedom could only be won through force. In the heart of that storm, a legend began to take shape. Not yet the king, not yet the crusader, but already the Lionheart in spirit, a man who would live and die by the sword, in a world where blood and honor were the only currencies that mattered. When Richard became Duke of Aquitaine in his late teens, he inherited not just a title, but a powder keg of ambition, rebellion, and cultural pride. Aquitaine was no ordinary land. It was the heart of southern France, famous for its wealth, refinement, and independence. The lords of this region were not easy subjects. They had resisted rulers before, and they would resist again. To them, Richard was a foreign prince, an English-born outsider sent to control them. But to Eleanor of Aquitaine, his mother, he was the rightful heir to her legacy, the embodiment of her family's southern spirit. She expected him to rule with both strength and style. From the start, Richard faced the impossible task of taming Aquitaine's turbulent nobility while proving himself worthy of command. What followed was a brutal education in power. The young duke soon realized that diplomacy could only go so far. Steel would do the rest. When rebellion flared in Poitou and Gascony, Richard crushed it without hesitation. His campaigns were ruthless, towns were burned, castles razed, and rebels executed. His enemies began to fear him not merely as a prince, but as a force of nature. Chroniclers described him as tall, commanding, and charismatic, yet terrifying in his wrath. He had inherited his father's military discipline and his mother's pride, and he wielded both like twin blades. War became his language. By his early 20s, Richard was already one of the most capable commanders in Europe. He led sieges with precision, devised complex assaults, and inspired fierce loyalty among his knights. He was relentless, often fighting on the front lines, drenched in mud and blood beside his men. His courage was unquestionable, but so was his cruelty. He showed no mercy to those who defied him. When a castle resisted, he would destroy it completely, not just as punishment, but as a warning. To Richard, rebellion was a disease that had to be cut out before it spread. His father, Henry II, watched from afar with mixed feelings. Richard's growing power was both a blessing and a threat. On one hand, his son was proving himself a capable ruler, keeping Aquitaine in check. On the other, Richard's ambition was dangerous, too independent, too proud, too much like Eleanor. Henry's empire depended on obedience, and Richard was beginning to look like a man who would not obey anyone, not even a king. Their relationship deteriorated rapidly. Henry had always tried to divide his sons, to prevent any one of them from becoming too strong. It was a strategy that had kept his empire intact, until Richard refused to play the game. The young duke's loyalty was to his mother and to Aquitaine, not to his father's endless manipulations. Henry saw in him a rival rather than an heir, and that realization poisoned their bond forever. As duke, Richard also faced the challenge of governing a land shaped by a different culture. Aquitaine was not the austere north of England or Normandy. It was a land of troubadours, poets, and romantic ideals. The code of chivalry was born here, celebrating valor and beauty in equal measure. Richard absorbed that culture deeply. He composed poetry in Aquitaine, sang of love and war, and surrounded himself with musicians and scholars. Yet even in this world of art and refinement, his nature remained that of a warrior. Behind the poetic verses lay the heart of a commander who valued glory above peace. The years that followed were a cycle of rebellion and suppression. Each uprising tested his endurance, and each victory sharpened his skills. In the campaign against the barons of Angoulême and Limoges, He demonstrated not just military might, but strategic brilliance. He understood how to use fear as a weapon, striking swiftly, offering no rest, leaving his enemies broken before they could regroup. But his harshness also bred resentment. Many of his vassals hated him as much as they feared him. Despite his successes, Richard's relationship with his father remained a battlefield of its own. When Henry II tried to force him into obedience, demanding he surrender key castles in Aquitaine, Richard refused outright. The old anger reignited. Eleanor, still imprisoned by Henry after the failed rebellion years earlier, encouraged her son from afar. She knew that as long as Richard remained defiant, Henry's control over his empire would be fragile. By the mid-1180s, tensions reached a breaking point. Richard's brothers, Geoffrey and John, maneuvered for influence, each hoping to secure a greater share of their father's inheritance. The family that once ruled half of Europe now tore itself apart from within. Yet among them all, Richard stood out as the strongest. He was the one with armies, victories, and experience. He was no longer the rebellious son. He was a ruler in his own right, feared by his enemies and reluctantly respected by his father. But power in the Angevin world was never stable. Henry II began to favor John, the youngest, sowing new divisions. For Richard, this was a final insult, a denial of his right as heir and an open provocation. He had spilled blood for the family's empire, conquered and governed in his father's name, yet was treated like an obstacle. The bitterness between them was now irreversible. Through all of this, the legend of Richard the Warrior began to spread. Word of his victories reached foreign courts. Songs were sung of the Duke of Aquitaine, who fought like a lion and ruled with an iron hand. He was already becoming a myth, the embodiment of chivalric valor, though those who faced him saw less of a knight and more of a conqueror. In these early years, the shape of his destiny was already clear. His ferocity, his charisma, and his obsession with honor would soon propel him far beyond Aquitaine's borders. Yet they would also bring him into direct conflict with the one man who had given him everything, and from whom he would soon take it all. The day was coming when Richard would no longer be just a duke or a son. He would become a king, forged in rebellion and baptized in war. By the late 1180s, the world of the Angevin was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. King Henry II, once the most powerful monarch in Christendom, was an aging lion beset by betrayal, not from his enemies, but from his own blood. His sons had turned against him again and again, and the greatest of them all, Richard, was no longer content to serve. Years of suspicion, humiliation, and manipulation had driven father and son to open hostility. Yet beneath their feud, the shadow of a new cause was rising, one that would soon define Richard's reign and his legend. In 1187, news swept across Europe that shook the Christian world to its core. Jerusalem, the holy city, had fallen to the Muslim general Saladin. The loss was catastrophic. The holiest site of Christendom now lay in the hands of Islam. Pope Gregory VIII issued a desperate call for a new crusade, the Third Crusade, to reclaim what had been lost. For many rulers, it was a divine challenge. For Richard, it was destiny. Even before he became king, Richard had embraced the crusading ideal with zeal. The notion of holy war, of testing one's faith through battle, fit perfectly with his restless spirit. He saw in it not just religious duty, but a chance for eternal glory, the kind that poets would remember. While his father hesitated, Richard took the cross, vowing to fight for Jerusalem. It was a declaration not only of faith but of independence. Henry II, however, refused to relinquish control. Even as he weakened, he tried to hold his empire together through cunning and political maneuvering. But his strength was fading, and his empire was fracturing. His once loyal sons now plotted against him with the aid of the French king, Philip II. Richard, who had spent years at war with Philip, now allied with him, not out of friendship, but strategy. Together they pressed Henry into a corner, demanding that Richard be recognized as his heir. In the summer of 1189, the confrontation reached its end. Exhausted and ill, Henry was forced to submit. He agreed to name Richard as his successor, but the victory came too late to heal anything between them. When the king learned that even his beloved youngest son, John, had sided with Richard, his heart broke. Within days, Henry II died at Chinon, murmuring, Shame, shame on a conquered king. He was buried at Fontevraud Abbey, the same resting place where Richard would one day lie beside him. The throne of England and the vast Angevin dominion now passed to Richard. At 31, he became the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and ruler of half of France. Yet the new monarch had little interest in governance. Richard saw the crown not as a seat of administration, but as a weapon, a means to achieve greatness. His mind was already fixed on the East. On September 3rd, 1189, he was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was magnificent, dazzling the nobles and clergy alike. Gold banners shimmered, trumpets sounded, and Richard, tall and imposing, entered wearing robes of scarlet and silver. Chroniclers described him as every inch the warrior king, handsome, commanding, and utterly confident in his destiny. Yet even this day of triumph was shadowed by violence. During the coronation festivities, anti-Jewish riots erupted in London. Rumors spread that the king had ordered Jews barred from the ceremony, and mobs turned on them savagely. Richard condemned the bloodshed afterward, but it was a grim reminder of how unstable his realm could be in his absence. Barely had he secured his crown before he began preparing to leave it behind. He spent enormous sums equipping the crusade. To fund it, he sold offices, titles, and lands with reckless abandon, reportedly saying, "I would sell London itself if I could find a buyer." His single-minded focus on the Holy Land shocked many of his subjects, but his charisma and determination inspired admiration. Nobles and knights from across Europe pledged to join him. At the same time, he began to build the alliances necessary for his grand expedition. His greatest partner and greatest rival would be Philip II of France. The two kings, both young and ambitious, agreed to set aside their hostilities and march together to the Holy Land. Yet beneath their oaths of brotherhood lay suspicion. Philip was calculating, politically shrewd, and wary of Richard's fame. Richard, on the other hand, viewed Philip as a necessary ally, but never as an equal. Their cooperation would be uneasy from the start. Richard also secured support from other rulers and maritime powers, most notably the Republic of Genoa and the Kingdom of Sicily, whose fleets would play crucial roles in transporting troops and supplies. The logistics were staggering. Thousands of men, horses, siege engines, and provisions had to be assembled and coordinated. Yet Richard thrived in this chaos. His energy seemed boundless, his confidence unshakable. He was preparing not merely for war, but for the performance of a lifetime, a stage on which he would prove himself the greatest knight in Christendom. Before setting out, he took steps to ensure his kingdom's safety. He appointed trusted officials to govern England, including the loyal William Longchamp as Chancellor. But few doubted that England was little more than a treasure chest to Richard, a source of revenue for his crusade. To him, the Holy Land was where kings became legends. As 1190 approached, the preparations were complete. Europe watched in awe as two mighty kings, Richard of England and Philip of France, set sail for the East. Behind them lay a continent divided by greed and politics. Before them stretched the promise of glory and the shadow of death. For Richard, this was the beginning of the journey that would define his name for centuries to come. The Lionheart was no longer a rebel prince or a warrior duke. He was a king on a divine mission, carrying not only the cross upon his chest, but the weight of his entire legend upon his shoulders. When Richard the Lionheart left the shores of Europe in 1190, he carried with him the restless energy of a man born for war. Behind him lay the divided courts of England and France. Ahead, the distant promise of the Holy Land, a place of faith, myth, and blood. The Third Crusade had become his obsession, and the voyage itself would soon turn into a saga as legendary as any battle he would fight. Richard's fleet was vast, one of the greatest ever assembled in medieval Europe. Hundreds of ships loaded with soldiers, horses, siege engines, and supplies departed from ports in England and France, bound for the Mediterranean. But even before reaching the Holy Land, the crusade was plagued by storms, rivalries, and intrigue. Traveling separately, the contingents of Richard and Philip II of France were united by purpose, but divided by temperament. Philip was cautious, politically minded, and easily offended. Richard was bold, impatient, and utterly unwilling to compromise. Their uneasy alliance began to show cracks long before they saw the sands of Palestine. Their first major stop was Sicily. The island was then a crucial stronghold on the route to the east, but it was also in turmoil. Its king, William II, had died, leaving the throne disputed between his cousin Tancred and the German emperor's bride, Joan, who happened to be Richard's sister. When Richard arrived, he found Joan imprisoned and her dowry withheld. Outraged, he demanded justice. When Tancred hesitated, Richard unleashed his army on Messina, capturing the city within days. His men stormed its walls, looted its wealth, and left no doubt about their leader's power. Philip, watching from a distance, was horrified by the destruction and Richard's audacity. But for Richard, the message was clear. He was not to be crossed. Tancred, recognizing the danger of defiance, quickly offered peace. He released Joan, paid compensation, and swore allegiance to Richard as an ally. By the time the English king left Sicily, he had turned an enemy into a partner and made the entire Mediterranean aware of his might. The winter of 1190-1191 delayed the Crusaders' departure, but Richard's restless ambition could not be contained for long. As spring arrived, he set sail once more, heading east with a fleet so large it seemed to cover the sea. Yet fate had more challenges waiting. A fierce storm struck as they approached Cyprus, scattering ships and driving several aground near the island's shores. Among those wrecked was a vessel carrying part of Richard's treasure, and more dangerously, his betrothed Berengaria of Navarre. Cyprus was ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine renegade who had declared himself emperor. Instead of offering aid to the stranded Crusaders, Isaac seized their cargo and mistreated Richard's survivors. That was a fatal mistake. When word reached Richard, his fury was immediate. With his fleet regrouped, he landed his army and marched inland. What followed was one of the swiftest and most decisive campaigns of his life. In a matter of days, Richard's forces crushed Isaac's army and captured the island. Chroniclers marveled at the speed of the conquest, a demonstration of Richard's tactical brilliance and unrelenting will. Isaac was captured, and in a characteristic display of theatrical cruelty, Richard had him bound in silver chains, a gesture that mocked Isaac's request not to be shackled in iron. By June 1191, Cyprus was firmly in Richard's hands. This victory was more than a personal triumph. Strategically, it was invaluable. Cyprus became a vital base for the Crusaders, a safe harbor for fleets, a supply center, and a gateway to the Holy Land. It also added to Richard's reputation as a conqueror touched by destiny. His charisma, already legendary in Europe, now spread across the Mediterranean. Merchants, knights, and even enemies spoke of the English king who could win entire kingdoms in weeks. But Richard's conquest of Cyprus also revealed the duality of his nature. He could be generous to those who submitted, yet merciless to those who defied him. To his soldiers, he was a leader of unmatched courage, one who shared their hardships, fought beside them, and demanded discipline and faith in equal measure. To his enemies, he was a storm, unpredictable, unstoppable, and terrifying. In May of 1191, as the spring sun rose over the eastern sea, Richard finally set sail from Cyprus toward the Holy Land. Ahead lay the city of Acre, where the Crusader armies had been besieging Muslim forces for nearly 2 years. The situation was desperate. Disease, exhaustion, and division had weakened the Christian army. Morale was fading, and the siege dragged on without progress. Then word spread that the Lionheart was coming. When his fleet appeared on the horizon, banners of crimson and gold fluttering above the masts, the weary Crusaders erupted in celebration. To them, Richard's arrival was like divine intervention, the coming of a hero sent by God. His reputation had preceded him. His mere presence reignited hope. Chroniclers recorded that the Muslim defenders themselves took note, whispering that the mighty king of the Franks had finally arrived. Philip II, already at the siege, received Richard with outward respect, but inward resentment. The two kings greeted each other as brothers in arms, yet jealousy simmered between them. Philip knew that once Richard entered the field, all glory would gravitate toward him, and he was right. Within days of taking command, Richard transformed the Crusader camp. He reorganized supplies, reinforced the siege engines, and led relentless assaults on Acre's walls. His confidence was infectious, his leadership undeniable. In this crucible of faith and fury, Richard the Lionheart became not just a king but a legend. His banners marked victory wherever they appeared, and his name began to echo through both Christian and Muslim lands. To his followers, he was the very embodiment of knightly virtue, brave, bold, and unwavering. To his enemies, he was the most formidable opponent they had ever faced. As the siege tightened and the city's fate hung in the balance, one truth became clear. The war for Jerusalem had found its champion. The Lionheart had arrived in the Holy Land, and the world was about to witness what that name truly meant. The siege of Acre marked the moment when Richard the Lionheart truly stepped into legend. The city, a vital port on the coast of the Holy Land, had been under siege for nearly 2 years when he arrived in June 1191. Crusader forces from across Europe had tried and failed to break Saladin's defenses. The camps were filled with disease, hunger, and despair. Then Richard came, and with him a surge of energy and discipline that transformed the weary host into a weapon of conquest. Richard wasted no time. Even though he was recovering from illness, he personally directed the construction of massive siege engines and catapults. He used his engineering expertise and military precision to coordinate constant bombardments, hammering the city's walls day and night. The Crusader army, reinvigorated by his presence, fought with newfound purpose. Within weeks, Acre began to crumble. On July 12, 1191, the Muslim garrison finally surrendered. The victory was decisive, but it came at a terrible cost. Thousands had died on both sides, and tensions between the European kings now reached a breaking point. Philip II of France, jealous of Richard's growing fame and weary of the desert hardships, decided to return home soon after Acre's fall. Officially, he claimed illness. In truth, he feared that the Lionheart's glory would eclipse his own. Richard, left as the undisputed leader of the crusade, accepted this with mixed feelings. Relief to command freely, but awareness that he now bore the full burden of the Holy Land's fate. After Acre's capture came one of the darkest episodes of Richard's career. Saladin delayed fulfilling the terms of surrender, particularly the release of Christian prisoners and the payment of ransom. Frustrated and unwilling to appear weak, Richard ordered the execution of around 2,700 Muslim captives outside the city walls. Chroniclers later debated whether it was an act of necessity or cruelty, but to Richard it was a message. His mercy could never be taken for granted. Saladin, upon hearing of the massacre, was enraged yet remained composed. He responded by killing his Christian prisoners in retaliation. The war had entered a new, merciless phase. The two great leaders, Richard and Saladin, had never met in person, but their reputations began to define one another. Saladin, the Kurdish Sultan of Egypt and Syria, was a figure of discipline, piety, and dignity. Richard was his mirror image, impulsive, flamboyant, and brilliant in war. Despite being enemies, they shared an unspoken respect. Each saw in the other the reflection of his own ideals, courage, honor, and devotion to his cause. In August 1191, Richard led his army south from Acre toward Jaffa, a coastal city that would serve as the next staging ground for the march to Jerusalem. Saladin, determined to halt the Crusaders, harassed them relentlessly along the way. The heat was brutal, water scarce, and discipline tested at every step. The Muslim cavalry struck constantly, using swift hit-and-run attacks that tormented Richard's army without giving it a chance to fight decisively. Then came the battle that would define Richard's generalship, Arsuf. On September 7, 1191, near the coastal plain north of Jaffa, Saladin finally forced the confrontation he sought. His forces surrounded the Crusaders, showering them with arrows, hoping to break their formation. But Richard held firm. He rode up and down the lines, shouting commands, steadying nerves, his presence alone enough to keep panic at bay. For hours, his army endured the storm of arrows, refusing to break ranks. Finally, when the moment came, Richard unleashed his counterattack. With trumpet blasts and the thunder of hooves, the Crusader knights charged in perfect formation, crashing into Saladin's lines like an iron tide. The battle was fierce and chaotic, dust, screams, and steel filling the air. Richard fought at the center, his sword flashing, his banner never falling. By the end of the day, Saladin's army was forced to retreat. It was a hard-won victory, and one that secured Richard's reputation as a military genius. The Battle of Arsuf became legend across Europe. Chroniclers compared it to the great battles of antiquity, and the Lionheart was hailed as a warrior blessed by God. Yet even in triumph, Richard remained pragmatic. He knew Saladin's army was far from defeated, and that Jerusalem, still deep inland, could not be taken without secure supply lines. The two leaders continued their struggle through both battle and diplomacy, a test of minds as much as of arms. What followed was a strange mix of hostility and mutual admiration. Though they fought fiercely, they also exchanged gifts and envoys. Saladin sent Richard rare fruits and snow from the mountains to cool his fever. Richard offered his medical expertise when Saladin's brother fell ill. There were even rumors, likely exaggerated, that Richard might marry Saladin's sister to create peace between their peoples. Though such plans never materialized, they revealed the curious respect that bound these two enemies together. Still, beneath the chivalric gestures lay a brutal truth. The crusade was no romantic quest. It was a campaign of exhaustion, disease, and death. For every knight who dreamed of holy glory, hundreds of foot soldiers perished in the burning sands. Both sides suffered, and neither truly gained ground. Richard won battles but could not strike a final blow. Saladin lost cities but never lost heart. By early 1192, both leaders were weary. Jerusalem lay within reach, but Richard hesitated. The army was depleted, the heat unbearable, and his supply lines too thin to risk a siege. He advanced close enough to see the holy city from a nearby hill, but in one of history's most human moments turned back. He would not claim the city only to lose it again. It was a decision born of strategy, not weakness, yet it haunted him for the rest of his life. The crusade had become more than a war between kingdoms. It was a duel between two men whose names would echo for centuries. In the eyes of their followers, Richard and Saladin were the perfect opposites. The Christian knight and the Muslim sultan, the sword and the shield, honor against honor. But behind the poetry of their rivalry was the grim reality of medieval war. A world where courage and cruelty walked hand in hand, and where even the noblest of kings could drown their faith in blood. By the end of 1192, the Third Crusade had ground to a stalemate. Richard the Lionheart had achieved astonishing victories, but not the one that mattered most, the recapture of Jerusalem. The truce he negotiated with Saladin allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to the Holy City, but left it under Muslim control. It was an outcome both pragmatic and anticlimactic. For a king who had crossed continents for glory, returning home without Jerusalem was a bitter pill. Yet Richard's reputation as the greatest warrior in Christendom remained intact. He had fought Saladin to a standstill, something no other crusader had done. But the journey home would prove far more dangerous than any battlefield. The Lionheart's path back to England became a desperate odyssey, one that would test his endurance and reshape his legacy. Richard left the Holy Land in October 1192, traveling incognito to avoid enemies who now surrounded him on all sides. His alliance with Philip II of France had long since collapsed, and Philip was already plotting against him in Europe, conspiring with Richard's treacherous brother John. Moreover, Richard had offended another powerful man, Duke Leopold of Austria, whose pride he had wounded during the Crusade by publicly insulting him after the capture of Acre. The continent was now a web of dangers, and every port could hold betrayal. A violent storm scattered Richard's fleet as it attempted to navigate the Adriatic Sea. Shipwrecked and stranded on foreign soil, he disguised himself as a humble pilgrim, traveling north through enemy territory. It was a bold, almost reckless move, but stealth was never Richard's strength. His retinue was small, and his manners too royal to conceal for long. In December 1192, near Vienna, his luck ran out. Spotted and recognized, he was captured by agents of Duke Leopold, the very man he had humiliated in Acre. The news spread like wildfire across Europe. The great Crusader king, the Lionheart himself, was a prisoner. Leopold imprisoned Richard in his castle at Dürnstein, but his motives were not personal revenge alone. He knew the political value of his captive. Soon he handed Richard over to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, a ruler both ruthless and shrewd. Henry saw in Richard a chance for immense profit and leverage over Europe's power balance. The Lionheart, who had once commanded armies across continents, now found himself locked in a cold stone cell, chained and far from home. Meanwhile, in England and France, chaos erupted. Philip II wasted no time exploiting his rival's absence. He sent gleeful letters to Prince John, urging him to seize the English throne. "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." John, ambitious and cowardly in equal measure, began plotting with French support, hoping to secure his brother's crown before Richard could return. For a moment, it seemed the great Angevin Empire would collapse entirely. But even from captivity, Richard's presence loomed large. His loyal mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s, yet still formidable, took command of the kingdom in his absence. When word arrived that her son was alive but held for ransom, she moved heaven and earth to free him. The sum demanded by Emperor Henry was astronomical, 150,000 marks, roughly 2 to 3 times the annual income of the English crown. It was a fortune so vast that it would take every resource of the realm to raise it. Eleanor called councils, levied new taxes, and appealed to the church for aid. England groaned under the burden. Silver chalices were melted down, church treasures confiscated, and every landholder was forced to contribute. The people paid, not merely out of duty, but out of awe for the man they called their Lionheart. Despite his long absences and ruthless taxation, Richard's legend had made him larger than life, a symbol of valor and kingship. His subjects endured poverty to bring him home. While the ransom was being gathered, Richard's captivity became the stuff of legend. Tales spread of the king kept in secret castles, his location unknown, until a loyal minstrel named Blondel discovered him by singing a familiar song beneath the prison walls. Whether true or not, the story captured the imagination of Europe, the image of a king whose spirit could not be confined by chains. In reality, Richard's imprisonment was as much political theatre as punishment. Henry VI paraded his royal captive before German nobles, displaying him as a trophy of imperial might. Yet even in chains, Richard's charisma never faded. He argued his case with dignity, claiming he had been betrayed by envious men, and insisting his crusade had been a mission of faith, not conquest. Many of those who met him, even his captors, came away impressed. He was still the Lionheart, even behind bars. By early 1194, after more than a year in captivity, the ransom was finally paid. Convoys of silver crossed Europe under heavy guard, collected from the sweat and sacrifice of the English people. On February 4th, Richard was released at Mainz, amid celebration and astonishment. Few kings had ever returned from such humiliation with their power intact, yet Richard's resolve was unbroken. The story of his captivity left deep scars across Europe. It exposed the greed of rulers who preyed on each other, even in the name of faith. It showed the fragility of an empire built on pride and ambition. But it also revealed the extraordinary bond between Richard and his mother, the indomitable Eleanor, who had defied age, politics, and distance to bring her son home. When Richard set foot on English soil again in March 1194, the crowds erupted in joy. Bells rang from every church, songs were sung in every town. The Lionheart had returned, but the kingdom he came back to was poorer, burdened, and weary. His enemies had not been idle, and his brother John had already betrayed him. The Crusader king would not find peace in his homeland. His battles were far from over. Richard had survived storms, captivity, and betrayal, yet the greatest challenge still awaited him, reclaiming his lands, his authority, and his legacy in a Europe that had changed while he was gone. While Richard languished in captivity, Europe became a chessboard of intrigue, and his throne the greatest prize of all. His chains in Germany sent shockwaves through every royal court. The mighty Crusader who had humbled Saladin was now a hostage, and the balance of power teetered in his absence. His enemies saw opportunity, his allies faced impossible choices. And in the middle of this chaos stood two formidable figures, one driven by ambition, the other by unbreakable loyalty. His brother John and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was well into her 70s, but age had not dulled her mind or her will. She had spent years imprisoned by her late husband, Henry II, and had endured the rebellion of her own sons. Now, with Richard gone and John plotting to seize the crown, she once again became the stabilizing force of the Angevin Empire. Acting as regent, she moved swiftly to preserve her son's authority. She summoned the barons, reminded them of their oaths to Richard, and demanded loyalty in his name. Her presence alone was enough to hold England together in its most dangerous hour. But John, ever the opportunist, saw his brother's imprisonment as divine providence. Encouraged by King Philip II of France, Richard's old ally turned rival, John began plotting to usurp the throne. Philip had already written to him gleefully, urging him to "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." The two men formed a treacherous alliance. Philip would attack Richard's lands in Normandy, and John would claim the English crown. John's schemes were both clumsy and dangerous. He began seizing castles and bribing barons, promising favor and land to anyone who would support his claim. He even tried to persuade the church to recognize him as king, but his arrogance quickly alienated those he needed most. Many of England's nobles, even those weary of Richard's taxes and absences, could not stomach John's betrayal. His reputation for cowardice and deceit made him unfit to rule in their eyes. While John plotted in the shadows, Eleanor worked tirelessly in the light. She wrote letters to the Pope and to European monarchs, defending her son's honor and denouncing his captors. When the news of the enormous ransom reached England, 150,000 marks, an almost unimaginable sum, she did not flinch. Instead, she launched a national effort unlike anything seen before. Churches melted down their silver, monasteries opened their treasuries, and commoners paid extraordinary taxes. It was said that every man, from the richest baron to the humblest farmer, contributed to the king's ransom. England groaned under the burden, but Eleanor's leadership turned necessity into patriotism. The people believed in their Lionheart. To them, Richard was not merely a ruler, but the embodiment of courage and divine favor. The king who fought for Christendom and had now fallen victim to injustice. Meanwhile, in the courts of Europe, the drama of Richard's captivity unfolded like a high-stakes game between monarchs. Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire held Richard as both a prisoner and a bargaining chip. He demanded not only ransom, but submission. The emperor hoped to force Richard to become his vassal, acknowledging his overlordship, a humiliation few kings would accept. But Richard, even in chains, refused to bow. When brought before the imperial court, he defended himself with eloquence and dignity, arguing that his imprisonment was a betrayal of Christian brotherhood. His bearing impressed even his captors, and chroniclers noted that he stood like a lion among wolves. King Philip of France, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to keep Richard behind bars. He offered the emperor bribes to prolong the captivity, fearing that the Lionheart's return would shatter his growing influence in Normandy and beyond. At the same time, he invaded Richard's territories in France, seizing castles along the border and pressing his advantage. John joined him, signing treaties with Philip and swearing fealty to the French crown, an act that would forever mark him as a traitor in English history. Back in England, Eleanor countered every move. She called councils of nobles, rallied armies, and kept John under close watch. When John's ambitions grew too bold, she struck decisively. His supporters were stripped of power, and loyal barons crushed his small rebellions. Her political instincts, honed through decades of turmoil, proved sharper than ever. She understood that holding the realm together required not just force but faith in Richard's inevitable return. While England sacrificed for their absent king, negotiations continued in Germany. The emperor finally agreed to release Richard in exchange for the vast ransom and his formal homage, a symbolic gesture rather than true submission. The collection of the ransom became a feat of logistics and devotion. Convoys of silver, guarded by knights and clerics, crossed Europe under threat of ambush and theft. Eleanor oversaw every stage of the operation, ensuring her son's freedom with a tenacity that astonished even her enemies. By early 1194, the ransom was paid. Richard was transferred from his cold cell to the imperial court, where Henry VI staged one final spectacle. Before assembled nobles, the emperor presented the English king as both captive and guest, Richard, proud as ever, turned the humiliation into triumph. His speech, part defense, part defiance, silenced the hall. He spoke of his crusade, his loyalty to the church, and his betrayal by false allies. Those present were so moved that they applauded him, and the emperor himself was said to have admired the king's composure. In February 1194, after 14 months of captivity, Richard was finally freed. Eleanor herself traveled through the bitter winter to meet him, her age defied by her resolve. Their reunion was one of history's most poignant scenes, the indomitable queen and her warrior son, bound by love, loss, and unbreakable pride. But freedom came at a price. England was drained, France was encroaching, and John's treachery had to be answered. As Richard rode toward his kingdom, the cheers of his people filled the air, yet his eyes were fixed on the horizon. The Lionheart had returned, but now he would have to reclaim his throne, his lands, and the honor that had been tested in his absence. The war that awaited him in France would be his final crusade, not against infidels but against his own blood and the shifting ambitions of kings. When Richard the Lionheart finally returned to England in March 1194, the realm erupted in joy. Bells rang across cities, crowds filled the streets, and songs praised the deliverance of their long-lost king. To his people, it was as though a hero from legend had returned from the grave. But beneath the celebration lay exhaustion. The ransom that had bought his freedom had nearly bankrupted the kingdom. Taxes had drained the poor, and church treasuries stood empty. Yet Richard's first act was not to rest nor to rebuild. It was to reclaim what had been stolen in his absence. His younger brother John, the would-be usurper, had fled before Richard's arrival, fearing his wrath. But the king, ever the strategist, chose clemency over immediate vengeance. He understood that open punishment might tear England apart. Instead, he summoned John to court, publicly forgave him, and declared the matter settled. In truth, Richard had not forgotten. He merely postponed his retribution, knowing the true battlefield lay not in England, but in France. For though Richard had returned home, his heart and his empire lay across the Channel. Philip II of France had used his captivity to invade Normandy, seizing castles and fortresses that formed the backbone of the Angevin dominion. The French king, calculating and patient, hoped to dismantle the empire piece by piece, while Richard was still consolidating his power. Philip's letters during Richard's imprisonment had gloated, "The devil is loose." Now that the devil had returned, it was Philip who would have cause to tremble. Before sailing for France, Richard made a final show of authority in England. He was recrowned at Winchester Cathedral in April 1194, a symbolic act to reaffirm his legitimacy and silence any remaining doubts about his rule. He also took decisive steps to strengthen royal administration. William Longchamp, his loyal but controversial chancellor, was replaced by trusted allies, and new measures were introduced to restore financial order. Yet it was clear to all that England, to Richard, was a treasure chest and a launching ground. The real war, the war for his legacy, awaited on the continent. By May 1194, the Lionheart had crossed the Channel once more, landing in Normandy with an army of veterans hardened by years of crusade. What followed was a campaign of relentless energy and military genius. Richard wasted no time reclaiming lost territory. His strategy was bold and unorthodox: rapid assaults, surprise movements, and a combination of brute force and cunning diplomacy. He rebuilt fortifications, rallied local lords, and exploited every weakness in Philip's lines. One of his first major triumphs came at the fortress of Verneuil, where he retook the town through sheer audacity. His tactics were precise and ruthless, swift assaults followed by total control. Philip's armies, though larger, struggled to match Richard's speed and decisiveness. The French king, once smug in victory, now found himself on the defensive. But Richard's brilliance in war was not limited to the sword. He was also a master of fortification, understanding that castles were the true keys to medieval power. He embarked on an ambitious program of construction and reinforcement, building what would become one of Europe's most formidable strongholds, Château Gaillard. Rising above the River Seine like a stone crown, it symbolized his determination to defend Normandy at all costs. "I would hold it," he said, "were its walls made of butter." Château Gaillard was more than a fortress. It was a statement, a declaration that the Lionheart intended to keep his ancestral lands whatever the cost. Within a year it was complete, towering walls, deep moats, and a complex system of defenses that astonished engineers of the age. It stood as a monument to Richard's vision and his relentless will to dominate both friend and foe. Yet war consumed his reign. Richard's days were filled with marches, sieges, and negotiations. His relationship with Philip II had become a duel of wits and endurance. Philip wielded diplomacy and deception as deftly as Richard wielded the sword. When brute force failed, he turned to bribery, trying to buy the loyalty of Richard's vassals. When that failed, he attacked border castles in lightning raids. Each time, Richard countered with greater force. The two men were bound by rivalry as fierce as any in medieval history, the Lionheart and the Fox, each determined to outlast the other. In 1195 and 1196, the war reached a fever pitch. Richard struck deep into French territory, winning key victories and reclaiming much of what had been lost. His armies advanced with ruthless efficiency, but his finances were strained to the breaking point. England, already drained by the ransom, was taxed again to support his campaigns. The people grumbled, yet they obeyed. His legend still shielded him from rebellion. The following years saw the conflict evolve into a Cold War of diplomacy and espionage. Richard forged alliances with discontented French nobles and the Counts of Flanders and Toulouse, creating a coalition to encircle Philip. The French king, cornered but never beaten, responded with offers of negotiation, all of which Richard met with suspicion. Their rivalry was no longer merely political, it had become personal, a test of pride and endurance between two monarchs who could neither defeat nor forgive each other. Through it all, Richard remained as restless as ever. Even in moments of peace, he was planning his next move, inspecting his fortresses, and riding through his lands with tireless energy. Chroniclers described him as a man who could not stand still, a king of ceaseless motion, whose hand was always on his sword. Yet there was also a growing weariness in him, a shadow of the crusader who had once sought glory in the East. His wars now were not holy but political, fought not for faith but survival. By 1198, Richard had turned the tide completely. Philip's forces were pushed back toward Paris, and the balance of power once again favored the Angevin Empire. The Lionheart seemed invincible, his armies disciplined, his castles impregnable, his enemies exhausted. Yet in this triumph, fate was quietly preparing its final act, for even the greatest warrior cannot escape the smallest wound. And soon, in the spring of 1199, Richard's endless campaign would lead him not to another victory, but to the battlefield where his legend would meet its end. In the spring of 1199, Richard the Lionheart seemed untouchable. After years of exhausting war, he had forced Philip II of France onto the defensive, reclaimed vast territories, and restored the strength of his continental empire. His fortresses stood unbroken, his armies obeyed without hesitation, and his name inspired both fear and reverence across Europe. To his enemies, he was the tireless conqueror. To his allies, the embodiment of courage and command. Yet beneath that iron facade, the toll of endless struggle was beginning to show. He was 41, still young for a king, yet aged by battle, captivity, and ceaseless ambition. The Lionheart had fought his entire life, but as fate would have it, death would come not on a grand battlefield, but beneath the walls of a small, insignificant castle in rural France. In March of that year, Richard was in Limousin, in central France, dealing with a minor revolt. The lord of Chalus-Chabrol, a vassal named Aymar de Limoges, had discovered a hoard of ancient Roman gold on his land. According to rumor, the treasure had been buried centuries earlier, and Richard, always hungry for wealth to fund his wars, claimed it as his own by royal right. When Aymar refused to surrender it, Richard marched to Chalus with a small force, determined to enforce his authority. It was the sort of petty dispute unworthy of a king, yet the Lionheart treated it like a campaign of conquest. The siege of Chalus was brief and largely symbolic. The castle's defenses were weak, and the garrison numbered barely 50 men. Richard, confident and careless, supervised the assault himself. On the evening of March 26th, while walking along the siege lines inspecting the progress of his engineers, he noticed a defender on the battlements, a young crossbowman armed with a crude weapon, perhaps little more than a farm tool modified for war. The king, amused, supposedly applauded the boy's courage as he aimed from the walls. Moments later, the bolt flew and struck Richard in the left shoulder, just below the neck. At first, the wound seemed minor. He laughed it off, joking with his men as the arrow was removed. But within days, infection set in, gangrene, the ancient and unstoppable enemy of warriors. The king's flesh blackened, fever consumed him, and pain spread through his body. The surgeons could do little. The once mighty Lionheart, who had faced armies and outlasted captivity, was now undone by a single filthy arrow. As he lay dying in his tent, Richard faced his end with a composure that astonished those around him. He summoned his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who traveled through the cold night to be at his side. Their reunion, though shrouded in sorrow, was filled with the quiet understanding of two souls who had shared triumph and tragedy alike. He confessed his sins, received absolution, and spoke calmly of his burial wishes. In a gesture that would echo through legend, he ordered that the crossbowman who shot him be brought before him. Accounts of what followed vary, but most chroniclers agree that Richard, in an act of unexpected mercy, forgave his killer. The young man, sometimes called Pierre Basile, fell to his knees expecting torture or execution. Instead, the dying king is said to have smiled faintly and declared, "Live on and by my bounty see the light of day." It was a final act of magnanimity from a ruler known more for vengeance than compassion. Yet after Richard's death, his order was ignored. The mercenary captain Mercadier, enraged by his king's demise, had the boy flayed and hanged, a grim reminder that mercy rarely outlived the man who granted it. On April 6, 1199, Richard I of England died in his mother's arms. Eleanor, now nearing 80, wept beside the body of her favorite son, the son who had defied kings, conquered enemies, and carried her restless spirit across continents. His death marked not only the end of an era, but the fading of a generation shaped by ambition and the crusading ideal. Richard's body was laid to rest at the Abbey of Fontevraud in Anjou, beside his father, Henry II, the man he had once rebelled against. His heart, however, was buried separately at Rouen, the capital of Normandy, symbolizing his undying bond to his continental lands. His entrails were interred at Charlus, where he had fallen, perhaps as a warning to future kings of the fragility of power. The three tombs formed a symbolic map of his life, England's king but never its son, a ruler divided between nations, ambitions and legacies. News of his death spread across Europe with the weight of finality. To his subjects, it was as if the sun had dimmed. Chroniclers wrote of a king without equal in courage or command, while others, more soberly, reflected on his flaws, his neglect of England, his ruthless taxation, his pride. Yet even his critics could not deny his greatness. He had redefined the image of kingship in the medieval world, bold, martial, and larger than life. Almost immediately, legend began to envelop him. Troubadours sang of his bravery, poets cast him as the perfect knight. The stories of his forgiveness toward the crossbowman, his daring escapes, and his defiance before emperors grew in the telling. In England, though he had ruled for less than a decade and spent barely 6 months on its soil, his name became synonymous with heroism. In France, his castles stood as monuments to his will, and in the Holy Land, even Saladin's chroniclers remembered him with respect. Eleanor, who had outlived her husband and most of her children, ensured that her son's legacy would endure. She commissioned chroniclers to preserve his deeds and celebrated him as the embodiment of chivalry, a narrative that would echo for centuries. To her, Richard was not merely a king. He was a symbol of their dynasty's unbreakable spirit. And so, as his tomb was sealed and prayers were spoken, the legend of the Lionheart began, the transformation of a man into myth. The reality of his rule, filled with blood, ambition, and sacrifice, faded beneath the glow of romantic memory. Knights would take up his name as an ideal, chroniclers would polish his deeds into perfection, and future kings would invoke him as the standard of courage. In truth, Richard I was both hero and human, fearless yet flawed, noble yet driven by pride. But legends seldom remember complexity. History would remember him instead as the Golden Warrior, the Crusader King, the Lionheart whose roar still echoes through the centuries. Long before the ink of chroniclers dried, Richard III of England was already evolving from man into myth. The Lionheart, as he would be forever remembered, had lived a life of extremes, unbridled courage, ruthless ambition, and a restless pursuit of glory. But the transformation of Richard into a symbol of medieval heroism was not a simple matter of deeds. It was a carefully woven tapestry of narrative politics and memory, stitched together by those who sought to preserve, embellish, and interpret his legend. In the years immediately following his death in 1199, European chroniclers began to codify Richard's life into a narrative of knightly virtue. Monks and poets, writing in Latin and vernacular tongues alike, emphasized his martial prowess and daring exploits. Battles became spectacles of courage, sieges were transformed into epic trials of ingenuity and valor, and his encounters with Saladin were framed as a meeting of equals, a duel between two embodiments of honor. Chroniclers often glossed over his more brutal acts, the massacres at Acre, his relentless taxation of England, and the political treachery of his campaigns in France. Instead, they crafted an image of the ideal knight, fearless, loyal to Christendom, and magnanimous in victory. Poets of the troubadour tradition played a particularly important role in shaping Richard's legend. In southern France, where he had spent much of his youth as Duke of Aquitaine, songs praised his courage, courtly refinement, and romantic sensibilities. Troubadours depicted him not only as a warrior, but as a cultivated man, skilled in poetry, music, and the arts of chivalry. These narratives emphasized his charisma and personal magnetism, transforming him into a larger-than-life figure who combined the martial and the cultured, a hero perfectly suited to the ideals of medieval Europe. Even in England, where Richard's actual reign had been brief and financially burdensome, chroniclers embraced his image. They portrayed him as a king who had sacrificed domestic concerns for the glory of crusading and the defense of Christendom. Taxes, war, and absentee rule were reframed as the necessary costs of greatness. To English audiences, the Lionheart became a symbol of courage, a monarch who placed honor and faith above comfort or administration. His absence from England itself became part of the legend, proof of a king devoted to higher ideals. Historians and writers in the centuries that followed added layers of interpretation and mythology. Richard was compared to heroes of antiquity, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and to legendary knights of chivalric romance. Each generation adapted his story to reflect its own ideals. In the Renaissance, he was celebrated as a paragon of martial valor and Christian heroism. In Victorian England, he became a moral exemplar, a figure of courage and virtue at a time when the empire sought historical models to glorify itself. Through these reinterpretations, the Lionheart became less a man and more a symbol, a standard against which warriors and kings were measured. Yet beneath the legend, the truth of Richard's life remains far more complex. He was a brilliant strategist and charismatic leader, but also impulsive and ruthless. He could inspire loyalty and devotion, yet he often treated his subjects as tools to fund his campaigns. He spent more time in France, Sicily, and the Holy Land than in England, raising questions about his priorities and responsibilities as king. His reputation for chivalry coexisted with acts of violence, political intrigue, and economic exploitation. To modern historians, Richard is both a heroic figure and a deeply human one, capable of courage and cruelty in equal measure. The enduring fascination with Richard the Lionheart lies in the tension between myth and reality. He embodies the ideals of medieval knighthood: bravery, honor, loyalty, and the pursuit of glory. At the same time, his flaws, ambition, obsession, and disregard for mundane governance, remind us that heroism is often inseparable from human imperfection. His story resonates because it is universal, a man striving for greatness, facing insurmountable odds, and leaving an indelible mark on history. Even today, Richard's life continues to captivate. Films, novels, and documentaries retell his story, often emphasizing the drama, romance, and adventure of his crusading exploits. Archaeologists explore his castles, historians debate his policies and campaigns, writers continue to reinterpret him through the lens of modern ideals. The Lionheart has become both a historical figure and a cultural icon, a symbol of courage and ambition, a reminder that legends are forged not just in victory, but in struggle, defiance, and the human desire to leave a mark on the world. Ultimately, the myth of Richard the Lionheart reflects the enduring human need for heroes. He represents the aspiration to rise above the ordinary, to face adversity with courage, and to craft a legacy that outlasts mortality. While the man behind the legend was flawed and complex, the image of the Lionheart endures, a testament to the power of narrative, the allure of chivalry, and the timeless appeal of a king who lived life at the edge of legend. Richard's story reminds us that history is never simply the record of events, but the conversation between memory, myth, and meaning. The Lionheart will forever roar, not only for the battles he fought or the lands he ruled, but for the imagination he inspired, a reminder that in every age humanity seeks its heroes, and sometimes history itself obliges.